Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the Civil War Museum's Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Doug Dobbin, the Educational Coordinator here at the museum. We're very excited today to have Civil War historian David Noe come to us from Poplar Grove, Illinois. David has done many programs for us here in the past and has been a great friend to our museum. And we're excited to have him here today to talk about a topic called the Great Camel Experiment. Now, David comes to us, he's an aircraft mechanic in Poplar Grove. He works on historic aircraft, turning some of them to flight readiness. And so we're glad he was able to take the day and come up and share this program with us. I think it's an appropriate program in that in December, we are going to be opening a new exhibit here at the museum called Defending the Union, Immigrant Soldiers Who Served in the Civil War. And David's program brings up another aspect of that. Not only were there immigrant human beings serving in the Union Army, but also immigrant animals brought over from foreign countries to serve the Union Army. So I'm excited to learn more about them today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Noe.
Well, hello out there. It's kind of strange not doing a program in a more or less empty hall here. And it would be a little redundant of me to ask for a show of hands how many have ever heard of the Camel experiment. There was never really an Army Camel Corps, but there was a Camel experiment where they tried to find ways of supplying the arid regions of Texas and the southwest United States. So without any further ado, I think we'll just jump into the program. When researching this program a number of years ago, have passed really since I really did it, I found it kind of difficult to sort fact from fiction. The internet, everybody knows, is full of information. Some of it fact, some of it based upon facts, and some of it pure myths. So it's been difficult to research, but it's also been interesting and intriguing. The story is full of names that anyone familiar with the Civil War will probably recognize. This is all pre-war information, basically. And then there are some that you probably have never heard of that were famous in their own right. So I hope you'll find it as interesting as I do. On paper, it might have been a good idea. It might have been even a great idea. If camels were the answer to the caravans of the deserts of the Sahara and other continents, why not in the arid regions of Texas and the southwestern United States? But the planners, the dreamers, and even the schemers didn't take into account the American psychic and its prejudices, nor did they foresee the event of a great civil war which would soon unfold and would terminate any of their hopes of continuing the project. In the early 1850s, the Army was sorely beset with difficulties in protecting the vast frontiers of the country. The transportation of men and their supplies over the vast reaches of territory was a problem that swallowed up liberal appropriations of money and used up literally thousands of horses and mules. It was a problem looking for a solution. Lieutenant George Crossman thought he had the answer. As early as 1836, he began to study the transportation of supplies via pack camels. His idea was picked up by one of his superiors, a Major Henry Wayne. There's Crossman. And Wayne. Wayne forwarded the whole idea to the War Department. That the suggestion that camels might fare better than the traditional forms of transport was met with both ridicule and opposition by most people, though. Undaunted, Wayne made a complete study of the problem, which found its way to Congress in 1848. Jefferson Davis was one of the senators from Mississippi at that time, and he rather liked the idea and championed it, as he was also the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. He wanted to have a practical test of the idea, and he put that idea forth in 1851. The suggestion that camels could be used in this country for travel, for carrying the mail, and for transporting supply was a topic frequently mentioned in the newspapers of the day. These suggestions were made by both United States citizens who had traveled overseas and from people from other countries that were visiting the United States and couldn't realize why we didn't try this kind of an answer. Indeed, there is some anecdotal evidence, and I can't really place my finger on this, but the Spanish had introduced camels in their conquest of South America several centuries before. George Marsh was serving as minister to Turkey and Italy. He had served in Italy, published an instructive book on the camel, and considered its introduction to the United States could not result in anything but a spectacular success. John Russell Barrett, who had been appointed by President Taylor as commissioner to oversee the newly acquired Mexican territories, strongly urged the president that camels be employed in the Southwest. The matter was debated by the Committee of Military Affairs once again in 1852, but again no action was taken. In 1853, Davis was appointed Secretary of War by President Pierce, and he became even more acutely aware of the problem of supply. So he further contacted Major Wayne once more and urged him to help him appeal to Congress by making a new report. This was submitted to Congress in the winter of 1853, and the report outlined the needs of the military and continued with the various proposals and the virtues of using the camel to transport supply and maintain a means of moving troops rapidly across the countryside. Congress, however, refused to act upon the measure, and the matter languished in the Appropriations Committee. I don't think Congress was any different then than today. But Davis was not about to give up. Again, in 1854, he requested a small appropriation to introduce a limited number of animals of several different breeds to test the adaptation of the camel to the conditions of this country and determine what animals or breeds should be employed most advantageously. Again, the annual Army Appropriation Bill was passed by Congress without any provision for the camel experience. However, in the final vote, an amendment was proposed by Senator James Shields of Illinois for the allowance of $30,000 to be expended by the War Department as it saw fit for the purchase of testing the camel for military purposes. Somehow, through the wranglings and the dealings with Congress, there was enough sponsors and votes that the measure became law in March of 1855. Secretary Davis wasted little time in starting to act upon what he expected to approve and proposed a far-reaching experiment. In May, he directed Major Wayne to proceed to the eastern Mediterranean, first stopping in England and then France, for the purpose of interviewing military men in those countries in regard to the use of the camel in war. I don't know why everybody never thought about that idea before, but this was the first time that they actually got opinions from other military people. The Secretary of the Navy placed the storeship Supply with her crew under the command of Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. The supply would be used to transport the animals back after they were purchased in the Mediterranean. Porter was ordered to deliver those animals to a convenient Texas port. It was believed that the climatic conditions in that part of the country would more nearly furnish similar conditions that the animals were accustomed to. Major Wayne arrived in England in June of 1855 and proceeded to the London Zoo, where he interviewed those most familiar and informed about the animals. He then went on to Paris, where he again met with people and military men, where he gained a considerable amount of information. He next traveled to Spezia, Italy, to meet with Porter and the supply. Porter, in the meantime, had completed his outgoing voyage and delivered the supplies he was supposed to deliver, and then he entered into the whole spirit of the enterprise. He visited the farm of the Grand Duke of Tuscany near Pisa, Italy, where camels had been bred and used for nearly 200 years. He learned that the original stock had actually came from Egypt, and originally an experiment by the Tuscan ruler. The animals were found performing a variety of tasks and were carrying loads up to as much as 1,300 pounds. Now, that's got to be a big animal to carry that amount of weight, and you'll see how much weight they carried later on in the program. So together, Wayne and Porter traveled to Tunis, where they determined they would obtain one animal, and that would affect their future purchases, because they felt the arrangements for loading and stabling the animal would be tested, and they would find out how good of sailors the camels really were. So while they were applying for the necessary permits to transport the animal, the ruler, the Bey of Tunis, became interested in their experiment and presented the United States with a gift of 2 other animals. One of those would prove to be a fine animal and became the veteran of the herd. Proving himself to be a sturdy sailor, he accompanied the supply for over 10,000 miles and landed at the end of a voyage in good health, the voyage lasting nearly 9 months. The voyage then resumed on to Constantinople, where both officers left the ship for a side trip to Bulgaria to learn about the British use of the animals in the Crimean War. There they learned the British were using large numbers of the animals. Some accounts say up to 25,000. I think that's probably a little bit high, but anyway, they were usually mainly used as beasts of burden. But they did have a mounted unit of 500 men who fought as infantry, but rode to battle on the animals. They also learned that the British preferred the single-humped Arabian or dromedary camel over the 2-humped Bactrian. Although the Bactrian was much stronger and heavier than the dromedary, the latter was easier to load and was a swifter beast. 2 of the original camels obtained in Tunis were beginning to show signs of a disease called itch. Fearing that they might infect the ship, the officers had decided to sell the 2, and that left them with 1, a grand total of 1, for all their efforts so far. They determined that Egypt would be their next port of call and proceeded on to Cairo. There they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The viceroy had placed a ban on the shipment of both horses and camels from the country. The country's livestock was being depleted by the ongoing Crimean War. It was with a lot of difficulty that a permit for the exportation of but 10 animals was finally obtained. But the negotiations drug on, and the 2 officers really expected to have to leave without obtaining anything. At this time, however, the viceroy learned of the experiment and proposed that he present a gift of 6 of his finest animals. The officers, thinking that their luck had finally changed, began waiting about a week for the promised animals to arrive. You might imagine their disgust when they were presented with 6 wretched, mangy beasts. Porter could hardly contain his disgust and voiced his displeasure to the Viceroy's minister. The minister, upon hearing of the miscarriage of his master's plan, laid the blame on those who had been trusted with obtaining the animals. Another week passed, and finally 6 fairly good animals were presented, and the supply sailed away for its next destination on January 22nd of 1856, with 10 animals on board. Arriving in the port of Smyrna, which is in modern-day Turkey, the officers finally met with some good luck. For awaiting them was assembled a herd of 23 animals that had been purchased by Mr. Gwen Heap. Heap's knowledge of the languages and customs of the East were gained by while serving as the United States Vice Consul in Tunis, and enabled him to purchase the animals at the best prices. Heap paid between $100 and $400 for the animals. The average price worked out to be approximately $250. Later on, distractors of the experiment would charge the government paid over $1,800 to $2,000 an animal. They stretched the truth a little bit. Heap also had the foresight to purchase the animals from the countryside rather than the so-called town camels, which carried a number of infectious diseases. The voyage began to leave Tunis, and the voyage home began on February 15th, 1856, with 33 animals. The ship supply had been modified to include a large stable below deck, which extended up through the top deck. If you've ever been on an old sailing ship, you'll know that the space between decks was rather limited. In fact, you have to duck your heads to clear the beams. So by extending that cabin up about 4 or 5 feet, the animals had room to stick their heads up and look out the windows. It was well ventilated, and to assure a constant supply of fresh air, which was determined that was beneficial to the health of the animals. Stalls were cleaned daily, and the animals were curried daily. It was a rough voyage home. Heavy seas rocked the ship, but the camels proved to be good sailors. In addition, they also hired 6 Arabs to sail along and care for the animals, and they hired a Turk who professed to be a camel doctor. The Turk proved to be a charlatan, however. His remedy for a cold was a piece of cheese tied around the animal's neck. For swelled legs, he mixed gunpowder and tea and wiped it on their knees. These and other questionable cures caused Porter to terminate his services. The Arabs also proved to be poor sailors and proved worthless in caring for the animals during the voyage home. It fell to the regular crew to attend to the animals. Porter, by his intelligent and energetic supervision, was able to keep his cargo in excellent health, however. During the voyage, 7 animals gave birth. 1 female died during birthing. Of the young animals, 2 died after being treated by the camel doctor. 1 starved to death when his mother refused to nurse him, and another was crushed to death under a larger adult. When the ship arrived in Indianola, Texas on May 14th, 1856, they had 34 camels, a gain of 1. After a few days of rest, the herd was marched in stages to San Antonio, a distance of about 120 miles. They then moved another 60 miles to a camp near Green Valley, where Major Wayne set about to establish a camel ranch in an attempt to breed the animals. The officer responsible for the general geographic area where the camp was established was none other than Robert E. Lee, although there is no question that he ever visited the place, and he probably barely ever even heard of it. Wayne's plans, however, were interrupted by Secretary Davis, who wanted to find out whether or not the animals could be adapted to the military service. The first small experiment involved sending 3 wagons each hauled by a 6-mule team, and they sent 6 camels back to San Antonio for a supply of oats. Returning, each camel carried approximately 600 pounds of oats, while each wagon was loaded with 1,800 pounds. Thus, 3 camels were equal to 6 mules in a wagon. The camels returned to camp in 2.5 days, while the mule-drawn wagon took 5 to complete the trip. Other trials followed with more or less the same results, prompting Davis to write in his annual report, December of 1856, that the capacity for the camel traveling over steep inclines and muddy roads was tested most satisfactory. On one occasion, instead of making a detour rendered necessary by the location of a road over a rugged mountain pass that was impractical for wagons, the camels followed the trail directly over the top of the mountain, during which time a heavy downpour rendered the trail all but impassable. The camels, each loaded with about 323 pounds, returned to the encampment a distance of 60 miles in 2 days, suffering no interruptions or unusual fatigue. These tests fully realized the anticipation of their usefulness in transportation of military supplies. The results of the experiment were thus far more favorable that could be expected. Davis also praised Major Wayne as the most intelligent officer and expressed his entire confidence in the experiment thus far. Meanwhile, something over $20,000 of the original appropriation was left unexpended. So in June of 1856, Lieutenant Porter was directed to sail on the supply and obtain another shipment of animals. Mr. Heap was once again commissioned to head directly to Smyrna. By the time the Porter arrived in November, he had collected from the interior a shipment of fine animals. The Sultan of Turkey, upon hearing of the experiment, presented a gift of 6 fine dromedaries, which were included in the herd. Porter also employed 9 men and a boy to help care for the animals. Apparently, his choices this time were a lot better than the first, as several of these men continued to be employed in the United States for several years thereafter. One of them, and I'm going to probably butcher this name, Hajai Ali, remained in service as a camel driver, interpreter, scout, and mail carrier until 1870. Porter sailed for home on November 14th, and although meeting with some of the worst weather he had ever encountered, he lost only 3 animals on the voyage of 88 days. On February 10th, 1857, he turned over 41 additional animals to Major Wayne. And then the herd was taken to Camp Verde, which, if you can see that, it's just in the middle lower part of Texas there, almost in the center. Up to this time, Wayne had lost 5 animals out of those original ones. 2 from Spanish fever, 1 from an epileptic fit, 1 from the bite of a particularly ferocious companion, and 1 from blows probably inflicted by an unkindly mule driver who did not take kindly to the beast. The second shipment thus raised the herd to 70 animals. Shortly thereafter, President Buchanan was sworn in. John B. Floyd became the Secretary of the War, and although he was a supporter of the experiment, the new Army commander in Texas, Major General David Twiggs, was not. Although he admitted he knew little of the experiment or the potential military value, Twiggs continued to barrage his superiors with letters of complaint. Although the experiment was barely underway, the new Congress asked for and received a report of the details thus far. A favorable but somewhat sketchy report followed, But it was a bad sign for the impatience of Congress at so early parts of the experiment. Then, more or less, disaster struck. For an unknown reason, Major Wayne was transferred to the quartermaster's office in Washington, D.C. One source, which I probably tend to disregard, but it said that his southern leanings made them recall him. In any of the case, the loss of Wayne's leadership was a severe blow to the experiment. During that summer, the Camels were used sparingly for carrying supplies and short scouting missions. In the fall, Davis called upon Edward Beal, an ex-naval lieutenant, Indian agent, and Western explorer, to survey a wagon route from Fort Defiance, New Mexico to the southeastern border of California. Accompanying Beal would be a herd of 23 animals. The journey took 48 days and passed through a largely unexplored wilderness of forest, plains, and desert. Beal spoke well of the animals' usefulness on the trip and reported to Secretary Floyd that the animals were subjected to trails which no other animal could have endured. In the desert, they carried water for the men and mules, traversed sketches of territory covered with the sharpest of volcanic rock, and climbed over mountains where the mules found it difficult to go. To everyone's surprise, they plunged into a river and swam with ease. Beal's report is somewhat contradicted by later reports that the camels' feet had to be wrapped with burlap to protect them from sharp stones. Later on, they developed a camel shoe, but that didn't always keep stones from working up between their toes. Camels have a cloven hoof. The reports and others followed induced Floyd in December of 1858 to request Congress to authorize the purchase of 1,000 animals. However, Congress did not demonstrate any desire to fund the project. Floyd made the same request in 1859 and was once again rebuffed by Congress. I can hardly imagine the difficulty of transporting 1,000 animals when the ship that they were using only held up, 35 animals. It would have taken forever to bring 1,000 in. Beal, in the meantime, made several expeditions over large parts of the Southwest. The animals, according to Beal's report, continued to provide valuable service. Beal cared for his charges so well that in 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, he turned over to the government quartermaster in Los Angeles, California, who happened to be a Captain Winfield Scott Hancock, a herd of 28 animals. These animals and a few others that had been brought up from Texas were held in various locations in Southern California. But with Beal's departure and the onset of the war, no one appeared to be able to find any more use for the beast. Beal went on to be appointed as a brigadier general of the California militia and was serving as the state surveyor general in 1862 when he wrote to Secretary of War Edward Stanton that the herd was being neglected and instead of increasing in numbers, had lost an additional 3 animals. He requested that he be allowed to do further exploration of the Southwest and requested that the camels be placed under his supervision. Once again, at this time, there were no earthly use to either the government or anyone else. His request was, however, denied, perhaps in part because it was discovered that some of the territory Beal originally explored and wanted to further survey wasn't actually owned by Beal or his business associates. So there was a little conflict of interest there. A few of the herd were used to transport the mail between Fort Mojave, New Mexico, and Wilmington, California. But this was also short-lived as the commanders of both posts filed objectionable reports. Based upon these reports and the lack of use, the Army Quartermaster of California, General E.B. Babbitt, obtained permission from Secretary Stanton to dispose of the herd. 35 animals were sold at a public auction on September 1863 to Mr. Samuel McLaughlin, Most of these eventually ended up in various menageries or zoological gardens. A small number were purchased by Beal and allowed to roam his property, living out the remainder of their lives in relative ease. A few were to be employed in a short-lived venture of commercial freighting in the Nevada and Arizona goldfields. But that's where the California herd ended. The animals which remained in Texas were employed in up to the years leading up to the Civil War, running various errands to various parts of the state. Their numbers increased only slightly, but as there was never a breeding program instituted that would increase the herd of any kind of a moderate way. The Texas climate, however, proved to be hospitable, and the animals were kept relatively healthy despite only receiving minimal care. At the beginning of the Civil War, the herd passed into Confederate hands, receiving only scant attention. Some animals were used briefly to transport cotton from the interior to the coast, and then they would bring back loads of salt, but that didn't last all that long either. A few animals later wandered off. There's an account of 3 roaming camels which were captured by the Union forces in Arkansas. These were sent upriver to Iowa, and in June of 1863, the Quartermaster General recommended that the 3 be sold at public auction, as the number was too small to be of any use to the Union. Without any doubts, others also wandered off into the deserts and mountains of western Texas and the territory beyond. At the close of the war, those remaining animals in Texas once again became the property of the federal government. But no thought was ever given to the continuing the experiment. Accordingly, the remaining 45 were sold by sealed bid on March of 1863. There were 3 bids obtained. The winning bid of $31, talk about Army surplus, was reluctantly accepted by Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, who expressed his hopes that private enterprise could better develop uses for the animals than the government had failed. The herd passed to a Mr. Bethel Copeland and his brother Everett, who immediately sold 5 of them to the Ringley Brothers Circus. They contracted with the Postal Service to carry the mail from San Antonio to Mexico City. However, thieves so menaced that route, it caused the loss of profit, so the venture was abandoned. The Copeland also had obtained a few animals that had been left by the Confederates in Mexico. When they brought the animals back into Texas, the federal government seized them as stolen goods. The seized animals were transported to Arizona, and as no one had any use for them, promptly released into the desert. That's your government at work. Copeland purchased property in Travis County and bought his remaining animals to begin a camel ranch. But after a few years, he gave up and began to sell off the herd to various traveling circuses. Thus, after a period of 10 years, the Army washed its hands of the program. The Civil War had ended the experiment, but there were additional reasons. The loss of Major Wayne had begun the downward spiral. Few other officers understood the management of the camel. The common soldiers and mule drivers were even less inclined to accept the beast. Many found the camels to be ill-tempered and claimed the animals held grudges against those who ill-treated them, awaiting only for the chance to extract their revenge by kicking, biting, or spitting on their enemies. The camel smell was also a bone of contention for both man and beast, as it was supposedly an unpleasant odor and caused panic and stampeding along with any horses or animals familiar with the odor. As a side note, at the Boone County Fair a few years ago, there were 2 camels there and they were giving rides. Well, I walked up to the camel and smelled him. He didn't smell any worse than a horse or a pig, so I don't understand where all this smell is coming from. But, you know, I'm a farm boy, so maybe I'm more used to it. Perhaps the failure of the experiment can best be summed up In the words of one disgruntled veteran, "I'll tell you why the government quit fooling with the camels. It wasn't because they didn't do a good job. They could carry 1,000 pounds of freight 65 miles in a day, and they went 3 days without water. But they scared hell out of every living varmint that sighted or smelled them, causing plenty of trouble. You've heard of how horses bolted at the sight of the first automobiles? That was nothing compared to the fright that those ugly loping camels threw into mules. The mules would lay back their ears and run for their lives. And then the mule skinners would cuss, causing the mules to only redouble their efforts." For years after the abandonment of the experiment, camels which had been wandered off or actually been turned loose roamed the deserts and plains. A number of legends and myths may have grown up over those years concerning the beast. One concerns the red ghost. The legend begins in 1883 when a woman was discovered trampled to death by some strange beast which had left huge footprints and clumps of reddish hair. Several days later, a large unidentified animal careened wildly through a mining camp and actually went right through a tent where 2 miners were sleeping. It too left behind huge footprints twice the size of a horse and strands of red fur hanging from a nearby bush. Several other sightings occurred before the animal was identified as a camel. A local rancher reported the animal carried a rider, but the rider didn't appear to be alive. This was confirmed a bit later when a party of prospectors said something fell from the camel's back as it ran off. The object, when retrieved, turned out to be a human skull. The camel and its headless rider continued to terrorize the populace for the next decade. It was finally killed in 1893 by an Arizona farmer who awoke one morning to find the ghost grazing in his garden. When examined, it was found that the camel had finally rid itself of its grisly rider, although it still bore traces of the leather straps to which the rider had been attached. It was never determined who that unfortunate soul was or how he had met his demise. Another story involves a camel named Old Douglas, who became the mascot of the 43rd Mississippi Infantry Regiment during the Civil War. William Hargrove was serving at the Camel Station when he resigned his commission in the U.S. Army to raise a Confederate regiment. Hargrove took one of the animals with him as a mascot. Old Douglas was used to transport the headquarters baggage and their cooking supplies, and met his end while the regiment was stationed in Vicksburg during Grant's siege. Apparently the victim of a Union sniper. I don't know about the Union sniper bit. There was probably enough lead flying through the air that anything that was out there in the open was probably hit. Old Douglas was felled as he grazed behind a Confederate fortification, and the men in the regiment severely went into a mourning for him before they sat down and had an excellent camel dinner. During one of Major Wayne's first trials, a Mrs. Mary Shorkley requested and obtained a quantity of camel hair, to which she spun into yarn and knitted a pair of socks for President Pierce. There was only one problem, however. The socks smelled, even after repeated washings and airings. What the president's action was, a reaction to the socks, is not recorded, but Mrs. Shorkley did receive a note of thanks for her effort. Other hair was used to stuff a pillow, which still exists, on display at the Frontier Museum in Bandera, Texas, but I wasn't able to find any comments as to the order of that particular item. In addition to the animals purchased by the government, there were a number of private enterprises which took place approximately the same time. A San Francisco company imported 20 of the Bactrian two-hump camels and started a freighting business to the Nevada gold and silver fields. As late as June of 1876, a few animals were still being used to haul firewood to remote desert mining camps. After that year, it is believed the remaining animals were taken to Arizona and returned loose as the company failed. In October of 1858, a Mrs. M. J. Watson notified the Galveston port authorities that her ship was docked with a cargo of 89 animals, which she wished to land. She stated the animals were going to be used to test their usefulness in transporting freight. Port officials, however, believed the animals were being used to mask the smell of an illegal slave trading venture. The animals were finally offloaded and left on Galveston Island. The ship was finally released. Camels were soon roaming throughout the city, and some were felled by victims as the local population tested the exotic meat. Others died from neglect and the lingering effect of the trip. Eventually, the ship was released and sailed away. 40 remaining animals were transported upriver to the ranch of Francis Lubbock, who became a future Texas governor, where they were tended to until funds for their upkeep ran out, and then they were turned loose to roam the Texas coast. In 1859, 23 Bactrian two-hump camels were imported into British Columbia. The animals were used to transport freight into mining camps in the mountains. The venture was short-lived, however, as the camels ate whatever wasn't guarded, including the miners' clothing, kicked at anything that moved within range, frightened other animals with their pungent odor, and had their soft feet cut up by the rocky roads. Their animals quickly abandoned the venture and turned the animals loose. Now we come to the final legends and myths. Hajj Ali was originally this isn't going over. Next slide. There we go. He was originally of Syrian descent and was one of the men that Porter hired on his second voyage to help care for the animals and teach others about their care and use. He was born Philip Tredjo, but changed his name when he converted to the Muslim faith as a child. U.S. soldiers quickly named him High Jolly, and he became a Western legend in his own right. Jolly worked for years for the Army, caring for the camels. He also accompanied Beal on his expeditions of exploration, and he later worked for the Army as a mail carrier, both with camels and mules, and as a scout for the military, and as a mule packer. He obtained a few camels and hauled freight until his business failed. He became a U.S. citizen, married, and raised 2 daughters. He reverted to his Christian name in his later life, but was, however, known by his acquaintances as High Jolly, and was ever associated with the Army's camel experiment. Tredjo died on December 14, 1902, at the age of 73, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in Quartzsite, Arizona. In 1835, the Arizona Highway Department erected a simple stone monument in his honor. The myths surrounding his death stated that he died in the desert hunting wild camels, and his body was found after a sandstorm next to that of a dead camel. But nothing can be farther from the truth. Poor Tredjo died along the side of the road in his near his home in Quartzsite of natural causes, probably a heart attack. A second legend or myth proclaims that the ashes of Topsy, rumored to have been one of the last surviving government camels in captivity, are contained in the pyramid. Topsy died in 1934 at the Garfield Zoo in Los Angeles and was rumored to be nearly 80 years old. Believe what you want, that would have been quite remarkable, as camels rarely survive more than 40 years in captivity. As was previously stated, the camels which have been turned loose or escaped continued to roam the deserts and plains of the West for years. A few offspring were born, but the numbers steadily declined due to natural causes and the hunting by both Indians and whites alike. The last surviving camel in British Columbia is reported to have died in the 1930s. A wild camel was supposedly captured in Arizona in 1946. The last reported sighting of a wild camel is supposed to have been occurred in Baja California in 1956. Take all these dates with a grain of salt, as the internet is loaded with conflicting claims. While this was taking place, they were experimenting with camels in Australia, also in the outback. And to this day, wild camels exist in the outback of California. A final myth concerns all those who believe that wild camels still exist in the remote areas of this country today. Those who believe cite unsupported claims of footprints and camel droppings found in the western desert. But the same type of claims are made by some concerning Bigfoot and a score of other creatures, as well as flying saucers. In my heart, I'd like to believe that the story isn't finished, but then I'm partly a romantic. As a side note, in 1885, a wild camel wandered onto the grounds of Fort Seldon, New Mexico. The young son of the post commander saw it and ran to his mother in fright. The post commander, Captain Arthur MacArthur. The son, Douglas, which was about 4 or 5 at the time. Just as a follow-up, some of the people that were associated with this experiment, George Crossman, who is given credit as the first one to think of the use of the camel, continued in the military, serving as a number of quartermaster administrative roles. During the Civil War, he was in charge of the Scully Hill Arsenal. In 1865, he was brevetted as a major general and served as chief quartermaster of the Department of the East until 1868, when he retired from the military. He died in Philadelphia in 1882 at the age of 84, a veteran of 4 wars: the Black Hawk, Seminole, the Mexican, and the Civil War. Major Henry Wayne, who actually took up the cudgel and went to see Davis about this. After serving as quartermaster in Washington, D.C. on December 13, 1860, he resigned and joined the Confederate Army. He served under Georgia Governor Brown's staff as a military advisor, adjutant, and inspector general of Georgia militia. He commanded the Georgia militia and military cadets during Sherman's march and was one of the higher commanders that was involved in the debacle of the Battle of Griswoldville, where the Confederate militia was basically annihilated. The supply ship, USS Supply, was a store ship used during the Mexican War. It accompanied the Perry expedition to Japan in 1853. It brought off officers and family in Pensacola in 1861, returning with reinforcements to Fort Pickens. It supported the Atlantic blockading squadron. In fact, it captured the Confederate blockader Stephen Hart, which was carrying over 10,800 stand of arms and associated war material. That capture resulted in the Confederates not using a sailing ship anymore. That the Stephen Hart was a sailing ship, as was the Supply. It was involved in several diplomatic missions to South America after the war and carried the American exhibits to Paris Exposition in 1878. Gwen Heap, that Western explorer diplomat, was largely forgotten by history. He published the first edition of the United States Statutes in 1851, diplomatic posts including the vice consul at Tunis. Published a historical account of the exploration of Colorado and with the Beal of Southern, and was with Beal on the Southern Transcontinental Railroad route. Edward Beal was a Western explorer, naval lieutenant, California militia general, California superintendent of Indian Affairs, diplomat, and early California financier. He aided Stockton in the Mexican War to secure California. In 1858, he was tasked to carry the proof of California gold rush to the discovery of California gold to Washington. In all, he would make 6 trips back and forth across the continent in addition to several western explorations. He explored the southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad, involved in California oil exploration and drilling. He served on the board of directors for several companies, and he was appointed by President Grant as minister to Austria. James Shields, the man who actually got the amendment passed to provide funding for this camel experience, is an odd man. He was the only man who has served as a senator from 3 states: Illinois from 1849 to 1855, Minnesota 1858 to 1859, and Missouri in January through March of 1879. He was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives before he was a United States citizen. He was born in Ireland. And in Illinois in 1840 only required a 6-month residence. He served as an Illinois State Supreme Court Justice and a state auditor. He nearly fought a duel with Lincoln in 1842 before they patched things up. When elected to the United States Senate, they refused to seat him on the grounds that he hadn't been a citizen for the required 9 years. He resigned, returned to Illinois, and won the special election to replace him. He became a Brigadier General of Volunteers in the Mexican War and as a Brigadier General of the Civil War. He has the distinction to be the only Union general to defeat Stonewall Jackson at the Battle of Kernstown. But in truth, Jackson probably lost that battle of himself because he failed to determine the size and location of the opposing Union force, as well as anything Shields did. The rest of his military performance was less than satisfactory, and he would ultimately resign. So I think that just about covers. I was going to hit one. Whoops. Reportedly, this is a Camel Bell, and you'll see these on eBay every now and then, most of them which are fake. The only original one that I know of is in the Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia. And they also have one of the original camel pack saddles at Fort Eustis, although I've never seen it. It's not on display. So that concludes my program. If anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to call in, I'd be very happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you very much for all your time.